Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dual Citizens. I'm Stephen McAlpine.
And I'm David Ould. This week on Dual Citizens, we're looking at censorship, cancel culture, and the limits of free speech. Are there any? What's the interplay between cancelling things and humour? And what does it all mean for the Christians? Lots to talk about, or maybe we can't talk about it. Let's get into it on Dual Citizens.
So will laughter be the next victim of cancellation? Jerry Seinfeld, along with other comedians, they're in the news. They're feeling the pressure to avoid biting satire or risk being cancelled. What do you think, Dave?
What do I think? Well, censorship has always been issued, I think, by tyrannical regimes against comedians and comedy. Probably most famously the Soviet Union, and this is my chance to tell you two of my favourite Soviet Union jokes. Are you ready, Steve?
They better be funny.
All right, here we go. Here's one I was just told very, very recently. So Yuri, the judge, is standing in a corridor and his friend comes to and sees him, and Yuri is absolutely beside himself with laughter, like he's weeping with laughter. And his friend says to him, what's going on, Yuri? And he says, I have just heard the best joke in the world, the funniest joke ever. And his friend says, well, tell it to me. And Yuri says, I can't tell it to you, but I just sentenced someone to 20 years because of it.
Yes. Okay. Boom, boom.
No.
No.
Boom. No. Maybe it's in the delivery. Can I tell you my other one?
You can.
So Ivan gets a call from the Lada dealership, you know, the Soviet Union car, in the 1970s. And they say to him, Ivan, we're really, really happy to tell you that we can confirm delivery of your Lada in 1998, May the 15th. And Ivan says, hang on a minute. Let me just check my diary. And he goes, I have to be the next day because I'm getting a fridge on that day.
Bada boom. You had to be there. You had to be in the Soviet Union.
You had to be there. Oh, well, actually, that's the point, isn't it? You had to be in the Soviet Union to see just how messed up that society was to actually get the humour in those jokes. And they really would crack down upon those who used humour, because it's a powerful, powerful tool, isn't it, to actually interrogate and criticise those sorts of ways of thinking.
Yeah.
But of course, it's not like that at all today, is it, Steve? We live in a free society, don't we?
Well, look, let's talk about soft tyranny and tyranny. I mean, is humour a weapon against both tyranny and soft tyranny? Because Jerry Seinfeld's talking about laughter in a Western setting.
Yeah, he is. So he's made some controversy recently where he's been pointing out that increasingly the left are trying to cancel guys like him who are making jokes about sort of political things. You've of course got the whole Dave Chappelle thing where he very bravely, doesn't he, regularly talks about the whole trans issue and just makes jokes about it. I'm not sure jokes that I would want to make, but still he's speaking into that area. And of course Ricky Gervais. You were telling me
Yes.
a little Ricky Gervais story the other day, Steve. Why don't you just remind us of that now?
Okay. This is probably funnier than anything you've said so far today.
Oh, harsh, but maybe fair.
Well, Ricky Gervais in his latest series, or his latest Netflix show, which I didn't find that funny, to be honest. I'll be honest, because I felt it was a bit nasty. But he said, I didn't think that I had to write, I don't think I have to defend a tweet from 10 years ago that says a woman can't have a penis. Because 10 years ago, I didn't think I had to say that, which shows how things have moved, right? That he thought that a transgressive statement 10 years ago isn't the same as now, but now you're saying things that you thought 10 years ago would be safe. And that's how tyranny works, doesn't it? The revolutionaries always find themselves surprised to be up against the wall with their counter-revolutionaries.
Well, they do, don't they? So, Trotsky, Robespierre all ended up getting killed themselves by the very revolutionary systems that they brought into place, which is really interesting because it has a lot to say about the political left and actually what they think is edgier and what isn't. So I think you were noting to me just a while ago that they push hard what they might say is edgy speech. But actually, it wasn't for the sake of the freedom of that edgy speech, was it, Steve?
No, it was a case of deconstructing what was there to reconstruct another power base. That once they have that, the left has never been a fan of free speech. History would show that. So it was about a deconstruction, perhaps a queer theory issue, that edgy theatre in the 60s can't be cancelled. But once you have power, and let's face it, the left has power, but it maintains power, I think, in the cultural setting by the perpetual victimhood, that if you tell a joke about someone having a penis who hasn't got one, you're punching down. When in reality, if you're in the HR department of a big organisation and you don't put your pronouns on your email, you might be in trouble. So all the power is still on the left, I think, in the cultural frame, but that still has to be viewed as punching down if you speak against it. It's kind of a mix.
And it is interesting, isn't it? I mean, this thing that Gervais is noting, and you're seeing in the work of Chappelle and others, it's that it's only when the thing becomes an issue that the comedians then actually step in and go, well, now we need to make fun of this. And so before that, they just weren't doing it at all. But now we're getting even the lovies getting in. So there was a piece I was just seeing in I think it's the Radio Times out of the UK, where even Dame Judi Dench is going, what's with all these trigger warnings around plays and so on? And she has this great line where she goes, can you imagine with Titus Andronicus, what you're going to need? You're going to need people a ring binder of trigger warnings before they even arrive at the theatre. And Matt Smith of Doctor Who fame, said, isn't that what we go to theatre for? To actually be provoked and to be surprised and actually to be triggered. What's the point of it anymore if it's not to provoke us and to get us thinking about things?
Which is why propaganda is so boring and art is so interesting, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And what about speech laws? What are they? There's speech law issues, do they tie into this? The hate speech laws in Scotland about what you can and cannot say. A comedian's going to get hauled off, some pub in downtown Dundee for saying the wrong thing.
Well, they're fascinating, aren't they? I mean, I actually watched a YouTube video the other week of some Scottish comedians who'd got together to deliberately take on those hate speech laws. And then one guy even dressed up as the hate monster, which was actually a very, very good little 5 minutes of him on a stage in a pub. What's fascinating for me about this issue is you see the confluence of some of the other things that we've been discussing, which all float around the same topic, where the definition of the hateful speech that needs to be controlled is entirely subjective. It's, well, I felt hated. And this is the point that the critics of course have made and that we noted earlier when we looked at it. It just becomes ridiculously difficult to consistently apply. But there is a consistency. It's just, I felt offended. I felt hated. So I don't like it. And of course, dare we say it, it's the political left that wields that tool, not others. And they use it to silence, to shame, to, as you pointed out, to control. So they hate comedy when it's used against them. Yeah,
it's not about censorship as per se. No one's going to jackboot you into history, I think, in the West, as much as they want you to self-censor in case something might happen.
That's right. And it's actually a mature society and mature groups that not only are happy to be laughed at, but actually embrace being laughed at. And just as an example, to parry off our last episode, who tells the best Jewish jokes?
Yeah, Jewish people do.
Jewish people, right? They love it. I've got a couple of Jewish friends, and often I say to them, I've got a new one for you.
Yeah.
And they're like, yeah, tell me. Now, go on, Steve.
Yeah, but self-deprecation. But look, come to the Bible, right? Here's the question. I want to go out swinging because I think I'm a bit lippy. But I feel like the Bible might just want to restrain my... I listen to Gervais and I go, I even with someone I disagree with, I would not be that nasty in one sense, because he verges on nasty, I think.
That's right. But you might be sharp. I think what's interesting about the Bible is as you say, and I think we'll talk about it in a moment, it places some constraints upon us in terms of godliness, but it doesn't say no to humor. There are some biting moments of satire in the Bible. Doug Wilson of Moscow, Idaho, he wrote a book a while ago called The Serrated Edge, where he goes through a lot of these things. It's a very good analysis. And just a couple of examples. You've obviously got Elijah with the priests of Baal, where he's basically mocking their god Baal? Is he on the toilet? Has he gone on a trip? Is he asleep? There's also, classic bits like, what does God do through Isaiah 43? He goes, so let me get this straight. You cut down a tree, you cut the log in half. With half of it, you chop the firewood that you then cook your dinner on. And with the other half, you whittle it into this idol that you bow down and worship. And the point, of course, is how do you know you got the right half of the log? I mean, just pointing out the irony of it. Even because Jesus himself I reckon Jesus is the master of snark. So, his whole, take the log out of your own eye is a bit snarky. But I think my favorite Jesus snark line, which is a bit of a hidden snark, but once you get it, you go, oh, that's good, is when he confronts the Sadducees, or they confront him over resurrection. And they just go, the guy with the woman with 7 husbands, and which one is she? Is she going to be married to in the resurrection? Aha, Jesus got you. There's no such thing as a resurrection. Well, Jesus says, you don't know your Bibles. They will neither marry nor be given in marriage in the resurrection. They will be like the angels. Mm-hmm. Right? And everyone makes that a debating point about, whether angels have bits or not. But the point is, and Paul tells us this, Luke tells us this later on in Acts, the Sadducees don't believe in angels either. Wow. So Jesus is just having a go at them. He just goes, they'll be like the angels, that other thing that you don't believe in, but also is true, and they're in the Bible. So there's plenty of scope for even ridicule at times, but there is a limit, isn't there, Steve? Where's the limit?
Well, you read Ephesians, let there be no filthiness or foolishness or crude joking. And so much humour today is based around those things. And so much of the cut through to win an argument is around those 3 things. It's very hard to get a G-rated comedian. There are a few, obviously, but and they're good weapons. But I just think we have to put those aside as Christians. We have to be very careful because Jesus didn't do those things. No. But he was still able to have a cut through. So we have to be careful, I think, on that one, David, don't you?
I think absolutely, yes. And perhaps you're a bit like me. You're tempted maybe to a little bit more of the snark than necessary. You want to be a bit witty and sharp, but there's a constant constraint. I literally, can I imagine Jesus going this far is always a really good question to ask. So now we're going to circle back to one of those topics that we look at regularly, religious discrimination, and both ways that it goes. And Equality Australia have released a video very recently, a campaign video, I suspect because we're waiting for the Labour Party to get back on the latest religious discrimination bill draft. But they've released a bit of a punchy video into this space. Let's have a look at it together, Steve.
I was fired for getting engaged to the love of my life.
They threatened to out me.
I was suspended because I came out in class.
I would lose my job.
I couldn't be prefect.
My school wanted me.
Scared I'll get fired.
These are real stories. Australian law makes it legal for religious schools to discriminate against staff and students because they're gay, trans, pregnant, divorced, or unmarried.
It's time to ensure
that our laws protect all of us
equally.
Authorised by Equality Australia, Sydney.
So that's a well-made little video. We're wearing black. We're mourning something. It's the stories are affecting. Like these are people who've been hard done by. Once again, the battleground is our schools. That's really fascinating again, isn't it? Here we've ended up again, and these people have been badly treated, haven't they? Or Steve, is there more context to this thing that would help to actually understand what is in reality going on?
Yeah, a few things I'd say. I've been in the Christian school sector for a long time, been to a lot of the conferences, spoken at a lot of the conferences. I don't know any schools that actually say to kids, you can't come if you're any sexual minority. It's not true. So Equality Australia needs to at least admit that if that happens once or twice, it is an outlying situation. But they won't do that.
I've still not heard of a single school where they've said to any student, simply because you're a sexual minority, you can't be here.
It's not true. And so I'm going to come out and say that. The other thing is, because I got pregnant or married the love of my life, is the tip of an iceberg of you signed a covenant agreement about what we believe sexuality is and what a human is, what marriage is, based on the framework of how the Bible puts that together. And this ethical community calls you to that standard. And I think the problem is, how do you enforce that with staff that are already in the school? Rather than simply how do you employ people who hold to a different perspective. That's always going to be the crunch point. But because it is emotionally driven and because it is stepping on people's authenticity project, that is the primary. Carl Trueman says our culture prioritizes victimhood. So that video all you can do is say, no, 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 no. And it sounds like you're trying to hide something. And are they being cancelled? That's the question, I suppose.
That is the question. We'll come to that in a moment. Let's just dive into just quite what's happening and just how it's sort of working its way out. We used to just be talking about the teachers. Now we're actually talking increasingly about the students, and there were a number of young people. In fact, someone very young, one of the people in that video. What's with that shift from not just the faculty and staff, but to the students? What's going on there?
Well, I think it's a post-institutional age at one level, that victimhood is also about students, and that the authenticity of a student and a student power in a school is very high. And if the younger and younger, we're giving agency about sexual issues to younger and younger people. So you look at that video and you go, why would that young girl be on there? Well, it's got to be a trans issue or something like that. And all the questions are there. Why is that an issue? Why are we talking about that as an issue at school? What's going on at home that comes to the fore? And clearly, it's moved down the food chain, the sexual identity question. But that's exactly what the culture wants, or well, part of the culture wants. The question then becomes, who gets to determine the framework of the school? Who gets to determine the boundaries of ethics within the school? And Christian schools are good at giving wide boundaries to non-Christian students. It's not true that they don't.
Yeah, and they certainly do. I know they do in the school where I'm on the council, and yet they want to have standards for the staff, because education is holistic. It's all of life, and so it's not just the content that you deliver; it's the manner in which you deliver it. It's who you are as you deliver it. And so, if someone is pregnant outside of marriage, or in a openly in a gay relationship, or whatever, that's going to run against that, isn't it? But it's simply the fact. I mean, I keep coming back to the fact no one made you work there.
Yeah, but the bigger question, of course, David, is not whether you should have the freedom as a school to do that, to say to someone you can't. It's that the progressive framework sees what Christian schools are doing not as an issue of freedom of association, but as an unconscionable act against people that is violent and that is oppressing their true identity, and therefore it is something that should not be tolerated or paid for by the government and should actually be policed. So Christian schools can argue all they like about freedom. It's not about freedom per se. It's about whether the perspective that humans are built the way they are, and the Bible's perspective on that, whether that's a valid public square opinion in the modern West. And Equality Australia will say no.
They certainly do say no, even while maybe fudging quite what's going on. And now, we should be fair here. We should reflect the same criticism that we make here back on ourselves. We all remember a number of years ago, Izzy Folau getting sacked by Australian Rugby for some stuff that he did on social media. Are we being hypocrites here? Are we saying, well, Christian schools get to, decide about these things and chuck people out, but Rugby Australia doesn't get to do it? Does that make us hypocrites?
I don't know if Rugby Australia's brief has anything to do with sexuality, except in this regard, right? That our modern corporations and sporting codes have taken on the vision of human flourishing that has as I call the secular age. And they've also become more intrusive, that we can lean into your private life in a way that we never used to before. That's very different to Christian school where you sign a covenant agreement because these things are central. I don't think sexuality is central to playing rugby, though rugby now believes it is, right? So, but if Israel Folau had signed a contract saying your social media has to represent the values, and these are the values of then perhaps yes, but I don't think they did. I don't think they had a contract like that.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. So had he actually signed that sort of contract, I think I'd be saying, well, he's got to go, right? Because we need to be people of integrity. If we agree to something, if that's the condition, we need to go. But I think we all recognize that it was an implied. they sought to imply such a contract, but it didn't exist. But having said that, there's a slightly related, isn't there, but not distinct issue, which is, do they even have the right to ask for such covenants? So it's one thing to say, did he or did he not sign it? It's another thing to say, do these big corporations even have the right to say to someone like Izzy, well, you just can't be talking about these things, let alone expressing these opinions?
Well, in one sense, it's the plausibility structure in the corporate sporting world at the moment anyway, isn't it? It's not as if there's an actual, here are the list of rights across all sporting codes. It's because sport itself has taken on a transcendence framework in our culture that seeks to speak into everyone's lives to promote what the culture actually wants to promote. And I went to a basketball match where that was the case on Pride Round, where there were signs on everyone's chair and the announcer said, hold those flags up, pride flags, when the announcer says so. And I was waiting for the harp, lyre, zither, and all kinds of music.
I was right there with you, big golden statue.
But the fact is, though, David, very few people bothered. It's like, yeah, please stop trying to control us on this one.
Yeah. Sorry, very few people actually took part, or very few people understood what was going on?
Most people didn't bother, or they were just disinterested when that thing came on. Because in the end, when you try top-down shaping like that, people just ignore it, or just will tick the box because they have to, but they have no allegiance to it.
Yeah, but so there is that tells you then, doesn't it, that there is this sort of a bit of a bubble of these people who are making these decisions, trying to enforce them, and in some places they have, this is just a question that occurs to me, Steve, in some places they have tremendous influence, and in others they don't. So what makes someone, for example, in a major corporation toe the line and wear purple on Wear It Purple Day and so on, but then when they go to the basketball game, they just leave the sign on the seat? What's the difference between those? Because I can see the same person going to work wearing purple, then going to the basketball and not bothering with the sign. What's the difference?
Because they don't want to lose their job and their mortgage or their friends, and people will do what is the path of least resistance. And to be honest, if we're swinging back to the start, that's how tyranny operates. Yeah. It operates on the basis that people will take the path of least resistance. And most people will take the path of least resistance. And it's only the outliers, and you can make an example of them, who will push back. And I think that's part of the issue, as much as anything, is when it comes down to these sort of vexing issues we see, that if we can scorn you into silence, but we can also sack you into silence. And it's not that you'll become unemployed, you'll become unemployable, because we just have to say to the next office or a corporation that you want to work at, when they phone for a reference, oh, he wasn't a team player. They don't have to say, he's a religious bigot.
He was difficult. And yet at the same time, there are many of these people who aren't liking what's going on. Here's my fear, Stephen, that when you look at these tyrannical regimes that have gone down in the past, especially when you look at what happened at the end of the 1980s, you end up with some serious disorder and even violence as kind of the frustration and everything bursts. I wonder if we're going to see, it would be awful, wouldn't it? But I wonder if we're going to see possibly some of that happening in the next 5 years, as kind of people do enough's enough and then work out their frustration at this stuff in really unhelpful and damaging ways.
Well, I saw that in an interview with Yuri, I've forgotten his surname, who left NPR. He was an editor, and he said,
"Yes,
we've got no alternate view." And he said, we're not representing a voice that, even if we disagree with it, we need to represent to keep the steam from building up. And I think that's what we've got. When it comes back to schools, your biggest fans should be the secular parents who send their kids to those schools, even though they don't know why. And you want to be able to say to them, actually, it's because of our framework. And you may not understand why we think this about sex, but it actually is going to be for the good of this community.
That's right. And actually, the fact that there is something we have to say about something that's really good for everybody, that's going to be the next topic that we look at in just a moment.
Okay, Dave, let's wrap it up. Let's land that plane, all the other figures of speech we can use. Freedom of speech, why is it a Christian issue, and how is it a Christian issue?
I think we've got to be clear, it is a fundamentally important Christian issue, because the gospel, the core of the good news that we have for the world, is a word thing. It's a spoken thing. I mean, it's nonsense, isn't it, to suggest, like that speech that is, I think, falsely attributed to Francis of Assisi, preach the gospel at all times, if necessary, use words. I mean, it's famously like saying, feed the hungry at all times, if necessary, use food. Now, the gospel is spoken thing. We see speech as God's main means of revelation and action throughout the whole scriptures. The whole Bible opens up with a speech act. God says, "Let there be light," and his powerful words bring light. Then the work of the gospel in people's lives is seen in the same way as God almost speaking them into life. The very notion that the Spirit which brings life is his breath, is the energizing force for his word is all there. And then, of course, the gospel declaration itself is a declaration of ultimately propositions, whether they're told in a story or simply propositionally, about what God has done in Jesus and what it means to follow him. If we can't speak, we can't tell people the gospel.
So, David, does that give us the right to offend people? I've got some thoughts on that, but what are you thinking?
I want to go yes and no. So we never have the right to be offensive. We've spoken about that a little bit earlier. But the gospel by its nature will offend, because the gospel tells us that we're sinners. So, Jesus' first publicly recorded words of ministry in his adult ministry, repent. And the notion of repentance is you're a sinner. And there's a bad stuff going on in you. And actually, it's not just what you do, it's who you are. And there's a great, glorious fix for this. But until you hear what the bad news is, you're never going to understand what the good news is. The apostle's really clear, isn't he, in 2 Corinthians? This message of the gospel, it's going to be the aroma of life for some, but it's going to be the stench of death for others. And in a world that is so much now, we speak about this regularly, this therapeutic culture, it's all about making people feel good about themselves. The very diagnosis of the human condition that the gospel brings is offensive in that framework. So it will offend. So we need to not be afraid of people being offended, but we need to be, I think, maybe we'll chat about this, we need to make sure we're not offensive in the way that we go.
No, look, I've just preached on John 3 and how Jesus brings a message of the gospel to an insider, a cultural insider, Nicodemus. And the next chapter, he brings the gospel message to a cultural outsider, a Samaritan woman who's been married too many times and it's gone wrong and she's culturally outside. It's the same gospel, yet he's able to nuance it in such a way that it deconstructs in different ways. Something about the way Jesus used language, because he's God, is just so powerful in deconstructing, which is what humour does. It deconstructs power stories, doesn't it?
Yeah, and again, to go back to Jesus' great joke about the angels, it deconstructs and challenges the Sadducees' view of the afterlife in order to, hopefully actually win them to a proper view of all that Jesus can do for them, to actually what the real truth and power of the word of God is. So I think what Paul says in Colossians 4, I'm not the only one who thinks this, but I think it's really helpful, isn't it? So what does Paul write? Colossians 4 verses 5 and 6. He says, walk in wisdom towards outsiders. You've got to be canny. You've got to think hard about how you're going to relate to them. He says, make the best use of your time. Let your speech always be gracious, by which I think he means not just gracious in nature, but full of the language of the grace that God has shown in Jesus, like the content of it, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. And the salt thing I think is really interesting there, because salt in the Bible is often a mark of judgment, even of death. So, think Lot's wife, think the salting of the land, think the difference between salt water and fresh water, and what it does for you. So what is Paul saying? He's go, yes, we want to be talking about the grace of God, but there are moments, aren't there, where we need to sprinkle that salt in, and it's going to be like, salt in a lassie. Let me use a comedy thing. Do you like salted lassi, salted licorice? I love salted licorice myself, but for most people, it just kills it for them. But that's what sometimes we need to be doing. Just dropping it in, just going, there is an issue here. There is a disturbance. Sometimes the speech that we give must make people go, oh, yeah, so that they then get how good what Jesus has done is. And we just need to be wise about how we do that. Thanks for watching Dual Citizens. I'm David Ould.
And I'm Stephen McAlpine.
If you like what you've watched, please do subscribe. Maybe even just leave a review or some comments. Make sure other people can hear about it as well.
Because we need more friends.
We need lots more friends.
He needs more friends.